to welcome everyone to the Responsible Conduct of Research second installment of the workshop series. It's the second workshop on authorship and reviewer ethics. We are very, very honored to have Dr. Stephen Fliesler with us again. And it's going to be very similar to last time. He's going to do some didactic work. If you have questions, please type them into the chat and I will present them to him at the end, right before the case studies, and then he'll do case studies at the end like last time. I do want to say thank you very much for those of you who decided to sign up for the micro-credential digital badge, and I have some of your work already and have returned it. And if you are still interested, please feel free to email me, Catherine Sonoda, cmp9@buffalo.edu. And I'll be happy to send you out information. It's okay if you haven't done the first assignment yet. I will be happy to let you do that about the same time as you turn in the next assignment. Not a problem whatsoever. And I also want to say that I'll be sending out the workshop survey within the chat, but also within the email as well. So I'll be emailing you a couple times as well. And we use those surveys in order to improve the workshop series and also to report to our grant people who actually give us the grant. So I appreciate very much for you being here, and I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful presenter.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So this is the second lecture in this workshop series. I talked about the definition, the currently accepted federal U.S. definition of scientific misconduct, FFP, falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. And I did discuss plagiarism in passing in the first lecture, but I'm going to expand upon that today and give you several cases that exemplify some major infractions in ethical conduct of research. So just advancing, I don't have any disclosures. So this is the outline for today's lecture. We've got a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to then just redefine for you plagiarism. There are some people who were not in attendance in the first lecture, and so I thought it'd be worthwhile to go over some fundamental basics with this lecture as well. And I'm going to talk about forms of plagiarism, the scope of the problem, both domestically and internationally. I'm going to talk a few cases of plagiarism that made the newspapers. I'm going to review UB policies pertinent to plagiarism and the consequences of engaging in plagiarism. I'm also going to tell you how we can detect plagiarism in published work or manuscripts submitted or grant applications submitted, and then how to deal with that problem, and how also some tips of how to avoid plagiarism, either inadvertently or purposefully. I'm then going to go into what's called a credit cycle and talk about the necessity for giving credit where credit is due. I'm going to be talking about the ICMJE recommendations on contributorships, earned authorship, and acknowledgements, and I'll explain the difference of those different categories. I'm going to talk about author responsibilities and assurances that you give to journals when you submit manuscripts for publication. Also briefly talk about duplicate or redundant publication. And then we'll go into the case discussions just like we had at the end of the first lecture. So there are a lot of resources out there. These are just a few, and you can easily find resources about plagiarism on the internet. Some of these are free. One that is free, and I would highly recommend everybody to download this free PDF, the recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly work in medical journals. And this is put out by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, or the ICMJE. Almost all of the major scientific journals ascribe to these guidelines. And also there's a Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, which was mentioned at the end of the lecture last week rather. It also was mentioned last year. And you can find that right at this URL that I provided here, that they have very interesting cases that they bring up on a regular basis that are exemplifying variances of acceptable norms in scientific conduct. So just to review, this is the current federal policy statement from the Office of Research Integrity, and a definition of what research misconduct is, which is fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. So it's very clear. Submitting a grant proposal, or executing research and making entries in a lab notebook or other form of recording, reviewing research. If you are sent a manuscript or a grant application as a reviewer, and then also when you have actually submitted things for publication and review. Okay, so this little cartoon I just came up on the internet the other day. I tried to pay cash for plagiarism, but they only took credit. Okay, so I'm going to talk about taking credit where credit is due. So just to review, the currently accepted definition of plagiarism is theft or misappropriation of intellectual property, ideas, concepts, original devices, substantial unattributed textual copying of another's work. Does not include authorship or credit disputes. A alternate definition is the theft or misappropriation of intellectual property, which includes unauthorized use of ideas or unique methods obtained by a privileged communication, such as a grant application or a manuscript for review. And plagiarism is worldwide. It occurs in every country that engages in research, unfortunately. Also, unfortunately, is that the biggest offender in plagiarism is China, our researchers in China, and there have been actual studies that have been documented to this date. This is a relatively dated study, but it still applies. And I see this as an editor all the time. Chinese authors, because they don't have facility with the English language, which is a very difficult language, especially for people who are in countries where English is rarely seen, they simply cut and paste whole tracts of text from published work because they don't have a good way to express themselves originally in a clear manner. I don't believe that the vast majority of cases are due to people who are actually miscreant, who are purposefully trying to pass off as their own ideas somebody else's work. This just came out last month. This report in Nature, China conducts the first nationwide review of retractions and research misconduct. Universities must declare all the retractions and launch investigation into misconduct cases. A Nature analysis reveals that since 2021, there have been more than 17,000 retractions with Chinese co-authors. So this is a pretty stunning statistic, and it's unfortunately is not being curbed and is a major problem. One of the things that we have seen in the last few years is what's called paper mills, where there are actual for-profit commercial entities in China where you can simply buy papers that were extracted from the worldwide literature, reconstituted, and put into a form as a publication quality manuscript. And we see this all the time in various journals. I see this unfortunately not too infrequently. It's not just science. There's plagiarism in the world of politics. You may or may not have known about this case about 10 years ago. The prime minister of Romania at the time was found out to have plagiarized major portions of his PhD thesis. And this came to light and was actually reported in Nature as well as the popular press, mostly in Europe. Didn't really make the headlines much here in the United States, however. I think pretty much everybody must be familiar with this case, where Melania Trump was giving a speech at a convention, Republican National Convention, and she had plagiarized outright entire tracts of Michelle Obama's prior speech. So it happens in everyday life, and what I call the Costanza defense, maybe people who have seen Seinfeld episodes. This is the very famous episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza was working with this company, and he had a inappropriate liaison with a maid, house cleaning staff on the premises. And then when he was called into the office to explain himself, he said, "Was that wrong? Should I have not done that? And if somebody had just told me that was wrong when I was first hired," well, pretty much everybody knows the difference between right and wrong. And courses like this are meant to increase your knowledge base about the appropriate do's and don'ts in our profession. So using the Costanza defense will not hold up in an inquiry of research misconduct. As you can see, there has been over the years a lot of literature written about scientific misconduct in general, and in particular plagiarism, and in particular plagiarism in biomedical research. And here's just an extraction from an article several years ago, and a direct quote: among cancer biology and therapies, 221 rejected article submissions in 2012, 43 had more than 40% of the contents similar to another paper. Half were matters of self-plagiarism, and half involved more so-called traditional plagiarism. While questionable research creates a serious problem for journal editors, it can create bigger problems for doctors working in the field and patients who may be receiving faulty treatment based on faulty studies. So it's a major problem. Now, a lot of people apparently don't know what self-plagiarism is. And certainly in just my casually asking some of my colleagues over the years, many are very unfamiliar with this, and unfortunately a lot of people engage in it. So this is not an ethical violation, it's a legal violation. Because of copyright laws, you can't copy substantial portions of text from one of your prior publications and then use it in a subsequent publication without placing the text in quotes and citing the original source. Similarly, you cannot use the same figures, illustrations, tables in more than one publication unless you get prior permission from the copyright holder, not the authors necessarily, but the copyright holder, and duly credit the original source accordingly. And this is most commonly an issue in review articles. Just today, Dr. Ramachandra Rao and I submitted an updated a page proof to a journal that we wrote a review article, and there is a figure in that paper that is reproduced from a prior a research article that we had published, and you have to cite where you got that, and that you also have to say it had permission. Pardon me. Okay, so it turns out in Canada as well as other countries, self-plagiarism is actually prompting funding agencies and research panels to review published work as well as grant application to look at self-plagiarism. So again, this is taking text that you previously published that is original to you, but because it has been published in a copyrighted form, you can't simply cut and paste and drop that into your next paper because you use the exact same methods in your research or commonly use, okay? So you have to find a different way to state it. And typically I advise people to say, this procedure was performed essentially as previously described, give the reference, and maybe say with the following exceptions or changes in methods. And that way you're covered. If you are absolutely finding it necessary to word for word insert that text in a paper, you have to do it with quotation marks against that repeated text and give the citation appropriately. Here's just a case, Jonah Lehrer, who used to work for Wired magazine. He was like a wunderkind, very popular, and later moved over to the New Yorker and was subsequently found out that he had plagiarized himself and cut an entire tracts of text out of a prior publication that he had published, and he put it into an article that he was writing for the New Yorker. New Yorker was not very pleased about that. So it turns out that there are electronic programs, platforms for detecting plagiarism. Elsevier, one of the world's largest scientific publishing houses, utilizes uniformly this tool called Authenticate. I use this every day when I'm reviewing new manuscripts that are submitted to the journal for which I'm an editor. And there is Authenticate publishes little blurbs about detection of plagiarism. And I have to say that nobody will go to the effort of creating a computer program or any other product that for which there is no market. The very fact that not only does Authenticate exist and has existed for several years, there are actually multiple such platforms that are available for purchase. And nobody would do this if there was no profit motive. So the very fact that these are popular tools in the publishing world means that this is a rampant problem. So I'm going to just briefly review this case. I mentioned this case in the first lecture. David Bridges was a very highly respected vision scientist at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, where I had done a postdoctoral fellowship. And he was found to have engaged in absolutely cut and dry, black and white plagiarism. So here's the case in summary: is he was sent a manuscript to review from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a work from a competing laboratory. Some weeks later, he declined to review the paper on the basis of so-called conflict of interest, but he didn't divulge that when he was first sent the request. Meanwhile, he took the experiments that were described verbatim in the manuscripts that he had received, and then he got the exact same results, put his own manuscript together and submitted it to Science, including verbatim methods. In that paper, during the review process, there were concerns that arose, suspected plagiarism. And as it turns out that one of the original authors of that first manuscript was sent his paper for review, and he realized that the method section was exactly word for word from his manuscript that he had submitted to PNAS. An NIH panel was constituted and they investigated the case. They found him guilty, and he was debarred from federal funding and peer reviewer activities for 10 years. The two papers are in question here are shown at the bottom of the slide. Here's a really interesting case. Annals of Internal Medicine is a major a medical journal, and here's an entry: "Dear plagiarist, a letter to a peer reviewer who stole and published our manuscript as his own." And then the editor of the journal published an editorial called "Scientific Misconduct." And here's an entry from the letter from the offended author. "Dear doctor, I'm aware that you recently admitted to wrongly publishing as your own a scientific research paper that I had submitted to Annals of Internal Medicine. After serving as an external peer reviewer on our manuscript, you published that same manuscript in a different medical journal a few months later. You removed the names of the authors and the research site, replacing them with the names of your co-authors, and I put co-authors actually in quotes, and your institution. So clearly this was done to evade detection, or an attempt to evade detection of plagiarism by submitting this manuscript to a completely different journal and hoping it wouldn't be reviewed by the same people. So what's wrong with plagiarism? So there's an intersection between ethical concerns, which is morality, and then legal concerns, as I discussed about copyright violations. Okay, the bottom line is either is going to be problematic, and where they intersect is the most egregious cases. As I mentioned, there are multiple tools for detecting plagiarism. A lot of these are used in academia, such as Turnitin, which is primarily used for reviewing term papers for college students, and it's also used at the high school level. So there's various things that can happen to you. You can be, your case will become known publicly. And so you will be a pariah in your discipline. You can actually be kicked out of the faculty, depending on how egregious the case is. You can be fired. If you're a student, you might be removed from your program and not allowed to continue pursuing your degree. And we talked about, there was a case that we discussed last week of such an example. So this university has a very explicit information regarding expectations of academic pursuits and maintaining integrity. And in this particular case, this excerpt is about penalties for plagiarism. And it says the penalties for plagiarism can be severe. They can include, if you're a student, grade reduction, course failure, student suspension, even student expulsion. University instructors are continually developing more sophisticated methods of detecting plagiarism, including the use of detection software programs. Examples of academic dishonesty, departmental procedures for penalizing students, and university policies related to plagiarism are available on the university's website, and there's this academic integrity URL, which I refer you to. So, very clearly, it is the policy of the University of Buffalo to maintain high ethical standards in research and other scholarly work, prevent misconduct where possible, and promptly and fairly evaluate and resolve any instance of alleged or apparent misconduct. So who does this apply to? This policy applies to all faculty, students, fellows, and staff at UB who are engaged in any manner of scientific or scholarly inquiry. Everybody on this call is covered by this. So I did, this was a year ago, about the same time, I just did a Google search on the terms how to avoid plagiarism, and well under a half second, I had 25 million hits. So there wouldn't be publications about this topic unless it was a significant problem. And so there's a lot of available literature out there that you can find on how to avoid plagiarism. But this is just distilled down, and I showed this in the prior lecture, how to avoid plagiarism. First, take clear, accurate notes about where you found specific ideas. Let's say you're researching a study that you want to conduct, or you're writing a manuscript up after you've done the study, you're doing a grant application and putting that together, you're giving a, let's say, a PowerPoint lecture, or you're giving an abstract at a conference. Take clear, accurate notes about where you found those specific ideas. write down the complete citation for each item that you use, because you're going to have to refer back to that and you're going to have to cite those things in your subsequent use of it. Use quotation marks when you directly are stating another person's words, and always credit the original authors for their information and their ideas. And like I said last week, I'm not a talented artist, so I actually got this particular drawing in the lower right-hand side from this site that I cite down at the bottom with the URL. And the keep calm and say no to plagiarism, I just snagged off the internet, which is not copyrighted. Okay, so here are some authorship ethics of what I call rules of thumb. Very simple. Give credit where credit is due. And if you take credit, you must be willing to take responsibility. So I'm going to talk about these now in order. Okay. So first, I'm going to discuss what we call the credit cycle. So let's say you're a newly appointed assistant professor here, and you got a startup package so you can, fund some research that you're going to do that you can then use to generate some publications, because publications are basically the currency of research, okay? It is what you need in order to have actually two things: preliminary results and publications that will demonstrate that there's feasibility, that you can actually do what you're proposing to do. You submit a grant application, and hopefully that gets funded, and now that gives you another pool of money that you can now continue doing your research, and then you're going to publish that work and then apply for more grants money. So it's a cycle and it continues to go. All right, so there are three ways that you can give credit. The first is the author byline, okay, where you list all of the people who qualify as authors, and I will talk about what those qualifications are in a moment. A second place where if a person doesn't qualify for authorship, but they did something substantive that you would like to acknowledge, there's a section in manuscripts or publications called acknowledgments. And those are typically in a footnote. And then there is, very importantly, the literature cited. Why? Because it gives a historical precedence, attribution, scholarly context of the evolution of concepts and hypotheses that you used in order to engage in your research. So what about the designation in authors? Well, there are these different kinds of authors. The so-called senior author, I'll explain that in a moment. A first author, submitting author, and sometimes there are other designees, but everybody who's neither a first author or a senior author is just a co-author. So a senior author decides on the list of co-authors and inclusion of acknowledgements. Typically, this is a group leader who has maybe designed the overall research project and has recruited a group of people to engage in that project. That senior author reviews all of the data and assumes overall responsibility of the validity of those data. And then that person is supposed to facilitate communication among the co-authors, the collaborators that are engaging in this research project. And this person also oversees the logistics of manuscript preparation and submission, and also handles the responses to reviewers' comments when you're making revisions to a manuscript or a grant application for that matter. The first author is something called the principal author, is, as the name says, it's the first name that you encounter in the list of authors. And that person typically will have the following three attributes. Number one, performs the experiments or collects the data as the primary person. They are also engaged in interpreting the results, and they are typically tasked with writing at least the first draft of the manuscripts that is then shared with the other co-authors. So it turns out in the scientific enterprise, in the business of publishing, the most contentious aspect of engaging in a collaboration is the number and the order of the authorship. And how do you determine how many authors should be listed? I have what I call the less is more rule. So basically, the fewest number of people that qualify for inclusion as a co-author, okay? You will see papers often in physics where there's 50 different authors. How do you ever even figure out who did what there? Dr. Ramachandra Rao and I are on a review that is published every several years in the journal Autophagy. And I think, Sri can correct me, but I think there are over 2,300 authors. Okay, think about that. If you go to PubMed, it goes on for pages with the authors, okay? The way the lead author, Dan Kliansky, decided to handle this is he just listed people alphabetically by their last name, okay? It's a reasonable way to do it, okay? But how do you consider who's going to be the first author, who's going to be a middle author, who's going to be the last author? You have to consider the implications of that location, the relative contributions to the project in general. Who decides this? Typically, it's going to be that senior author, but there has to be a discussion amongst all of the people that are engaged in the study, and there has to be an agreement about how this is going to be handled going down the line. And I have this little quote down at the bottom. If you're not the first author and you're not the last author, you're et al. So you will see that typically, if there are more than 2, sometimes 3 authors that are cited in a reference list, it'll say the first author's last name and then et al. Everybody else is what that means, okay? And consider the differences between authorship and acknowledgement, and I'm going to address this now. So there's a concept of what's called earned authorship. First thing is it's the participation. Is it an active participation or a passive role? Was it physical, like actually working in a laboratory and doing some kind of procedures? Or was it more intellectual, just ideas, concepts, and discussion of the results? What about the initial conception of and the design of a project? What about the analysis of the data and interpretation of those data? Then drafting a manuscript, revising a manuscript, and final approval. That part is typically the lab director or the senior author in many cases, or if it's a doctoral work, it's the thesis advisor most typically. So what constitutes a significant contribution? First, it has to have a major effect on the direction, scope, or depth of the research. This is extracted from the ORO and ICMJE guidelines. It can include conceptualization, design, execution, and/or interpretation of the research, and development of necessary methodology and/or data analysis. So there might be a person who had relatively little engagement in the overall project, but they contributed something that without which the project wouldn't have gone forward, okay? So maybe they didn't come up with the original idea, maybe they didn't write the first draft of the manuscript, but they contributed something that you couldn't have had the study go to fruition without them, okay? But all of the people who have a significant contribution must have a clear understanding of the project goals. And what that means is, as I'm going to about to talk about in responsibilities, is that you may be called upon to explain various aspects of a paper that you have published, possibly in a review procedure. You have to know that paper inside and out. Okay, so what does not constitute significant contributions and therefore does not qualify a person for authorship? simply providing funding for the project. This is typically in very large research groups, let's say a division chief who then has a very large collaborative study that involves a bunch of people, and maybe that person got the money, the grant funding for it, but maybe other people had developed, conceptualized the study and executed the study, and people who are fairly senior, like myself, we typically are not working in our laboratories anymore, so we're not collecting the data directly, but just providing the funding does not count as a significant contribution, and therefore it does not qualify for authorship. Merely being the group leader does not qualify. Providing space, instrumentation, reagents does not qualify solely. Performing routine technical work. If you're hired as a technician, you come in, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, you do some procedures in the laboratory, hang up your lab coat, go home, watch movies, whatever. You're not actually fully engaged in the study. You're getting paid for that technical work. You don't qualify as a co-author. Certainly not performing fee-for-service work. You send out DNA analysis, a request, do sequencing and what have you. You're paying for that work as a service. The people who perform that analysis don't become co-authors. And merely editing a manuscript does not qualify you as a co-author. There's something else that's kind of sinister. It happens not infrequently. It's called ransoming authorship. So somebody publishes, let's say, a paper, and they've developed an antibody, a novel antibody that you can't buy commercially, or they develop a viral vector that you can use for packaging some a gene that you want to use in your laboratory for gene therapy, or some other reagent of some kind that you can't readily get anywhere else except from this, let's say, one source. And so here's an article that was published several years ago. It says one scientist hoarded a rare virus strain for more than a decade, refusing requests to let other researchers study it. Others refused to share biological materials like cloned genes unless they were included as authors on any resulting discovery. A nice way to boost a resume. Yeah, so that's a problem. Now, it turns out the NIH has now put their foot down in the last 10 years or more, where you are required to share any materials, biological or otherwise, that were generated in the course of federally funded research. So you develop a reagent, and a viral strain, a cell line, whatever. Once a person has been the originator, is given sufficient time to publish their work and to get credit for that work, they are bound by federal guidelines that they must share their materials with other investigators. So here are the responsibilities of authorships. You have to have accountability as well as taking credit. You can't disavow responsibility for errors of conduct, whether by honest mistake or by outright deceit. I talked about a case in South Korea where there was at that time, world famous investigator who had assembled a team of international investigators. They had published 2 papers in Science. They were heralded as major breakthroughs in stem cell biology. They were found to be falsified and fabricated, and everybody who was on the co-author line, not just the people who engaged in the actual misconduct, everybody was brought under suspicion, and their contributions were reviewed to the work, and their positions were threatened, and in some cases, these people were fired. Okay. The bottom line is, unless there's explicit indication of responsibility or role in a project, each author shares the responsibility for all of the manuscript content. And so there are things called explicit disclosure, which I'll talk about in a moment, that helps you so that your responsibility or scope of responsibility can be somewhat mitigated. So the author's assurances to a journal. First, you have an assigned statement from all the authors or by the corresponding author, the communicating author, with full knowledge and consent of others. Assurances against copyright violations or property right of any third party. Assurances taking responsibility for entirety of the contents and conclusions in the manuscript, or assurances against financial or any other conflicts of interest. Here's an example of a statement in the guide for authors for all scientific journals under the Elsevier Publishing House. Verification of authorship and copyright is, quote, authors are responsible for ensuring the integrity and quality of their reported research. Prior to publication, all authors are required to attest to this by signing a letter of submission. No manuscript will be published without this consent. And it goes off to tell more about copyright transfer and what have you. There is a practice that used to be a lot more common called honorary or gift authorship, but it still occurs. And what it is it's assigning authorship to a person who had little or nothing to do with the project or manuscript derived therefrom. Why is this done? This is more typically when more junior authors want to have additional gravitas ascribed to their work. So they put co-authors, so-called co-authors, on their paper who have high level of standing in the scientific discipline, just to sort of give it a boost during the review process. This is actually completely unethical. The flip side of gift authorship is authorship exclusion. Failure to include a person as co-author when that person has substantively contributed to a study or project, or in other words, qualifies as an earned authorship. Excluding somebody who qualifies as a co-author from reviewing primary data, drafts of the manuscripts that have been utilized at that person's intellectual property, their data, etc., for the purpose of preventing them from having knowledge about the intended submission of a manuscript. That's punitive action. This is comparable to theft. It robs the individual of due credit. The bottom line, all persons designated as authors should qualify for authorship, and the order of authorship should be a joint decision of all co-authors. Participation must be sufficient to take public responsibility for content of the manuscript. And these are the qualifications that the ICMJE have put forward, and they are three: conception and design, or analysis and interpretation of the data, drafting the article or revising the article critically for important intellectual content, and also the final approval of draft to be submitted. All three of these conditions must be met. And you will see any manuscripts these days that you submit will have this checklist of things that you say, I am testifying, I am validating that I have done all of these things, and all persons who are listed as a co-author qualify for authorship. And then there will be even very explicit, like in the MDPI journals, and there are thousands of them apparently, where there's a whole group of things where who drafted this, who collected the data, who interpreted the data. There's a whole series of things that you have to then put the initials of the various co-authors next to ascribe these contributions. Okay. So all persons designated as authors should qualify for authorship, and all those who qualify should be listed. It basically succinctly extracts all of the previous slides that I've just put forward. I mentioned this concept of explicit disclosure. So here, this was more than a decade ago. The editor-in-chief of a science magazine at the time introduced a rule for scientific science contributors. The editor announced in this editorial that in order to combat honorary authorship, contributors to science as well as to Nature and PNAS who shared in the development of these principles would have to describe their contributions to the article prior to its acceptance. This is similar to the policies that Drummond Rennie promoted at the JAMA, except that science, the information is kept on file but not routinely published. Furthermore, in order to improve accountability, a senior author from each laboratory or group participating in the collaboration must now certify that she or he has reviewed the original data and its representation. And I talked about a case last week where a very famous, actually a Nobel Prize winning author had to retract some papers because an underling in her laboratory at Harvard had falsified data, and they had to retract these papers. It was very, very important that the senior author reviews the original data. In my lab group, I have a routine practice. We meet as a lab group every week and review data and what was accomplished or not accomplished during the previous week, and then discuss plans for what we're going to be doing in the next week. It's extremely important to have regular tabs on what's going on in your research group. Okay, acknowledgements. So I mentioned there's a specific section in most manuscripts about acknowledgements. All contributors who do not meet the criteria for authorship should be listed in an acknowledgement section. Examples of those might be acknowledged include a person who provided purely technical help, writing assistance, a department chair who provided only general support. Editors should ask authors to disclose whether they had writing assistance, such as one of these professional editing services, and to identify the entity that paid for this assistance. Financial and material support should also be acknowledged. So you typically have to list grant support explicitly with grant numbers and the agency. Here at the VA, we are also required to acknowledge the support by provision of resources and facilities in which we conducted the research. And then I mentioned the third way of giving credit where credit is due is citing the literature. It gives historical precedent to your work. It should be sufficient to provide adequate intellectual context for your work. So you need to acknowledge who came before you and who basically provided the foundational literature on which you based your own studies. You should not purposely exclude contributions from others, particularly your competitors. This is unfortunately a problem in the literature, and you will see sometimes when you get a review back and the reviewer will say, oh, this person needs to cite these 5 papers by me, basically, where they give the names, but you can see that obviously they're just trying to pad the literature citations so that their H-index will go up. It should be cited in the style and format of the journal to which your manuscript has been submitted for publication. So today, I received 12 manuscripts, new submissions for the journal over which I serve as the editor-in-chief, and 4 of them clearly didn't even read the guide for authors, and the format of their reference citations was not this journal's style, so I had to send it back to them for them to fix that. Okay, so then here's this white paper from another council called Council of Science Editors. This is a white paper promoting integrity in scientific journal publications. And I wanted to just point out of all the various things, and they talk about all the things I just talked about authorship, contributorships, and what have you. Uh, what do you do about the case of a deceased author? It might seem odd to you, but I'm going to give you a case in just a moment. Okay. So they say, the CSA says, for cases in which a co-author dies or is incapacitated during the writing, submission, or peer review process, co-authors should obtain disclosure and copyright documentation from a familial or legal proxy. Okay. Unfortunately, this actually happened to me. I didn't die. One of my colleagues did, quite unexpectedly. A good friend and faculty member here at UB passed away 2 years ago out of the clear blue. And we were engaged in a study, and we haven't been able to publish anything yet because I can't even get all of the data because the lab just evaporated basically. But if we ever do extract anything from what the data that we do have access to, we'll have to deal with his contributions, which were significant in the authorship byline. So here's an example. Here's a multiple papers out of the laboratory of Professor George Schroepfer at Rice University. He happened to be my PhD advisor many years ago. And he was a world famous expert on cholesterol metabolism. So here are all these papers that are published 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. The problem is that Dr. Schroepfer died in 1998. So I say highly unlikely that he designed the experiments, collected or reviewed the data, could not possibly have written or approved the submitted manuscript because he'd been dead for years. All right. So how do you deal with this? Okay. There are appropriate ways to do it. What you will see in papers in these kinds of instances, you'll see a little asterisk next to the deceased person's name, and it will be a footnote, and it will say just deceased or D for a period, and then give the date. Maybe there'll be additional verbiage in the acknowledgments of thanking the contributions of that person who had unfortunately passed away during the course of the study or the manuscript preparation or what have you. Okay. This is another violation, duplicate or double publishing. Duplicate publication of essentially the same data constitutes a violation of copyright law and of the ethics of scientific publishing. Do not submit the same manuscript to more than one journal simultaneously. Okay, there was a famous case in this journal, Investigative Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences, which is a major journal in my field, where an author had submitted the exact same manuscript with slightly different title and a few words changed to a different journal at the exact same time. And as luck have it, both of those papers were accepted for publication simultaneously. And it was discovered after the fact that he had engaged in this. Little footnote on this particular author. He happened to work in the laboratory of David Bridges, who I mentioned at the outset of this lecture. He claimed that he didn't know there was anything wrong with that. Now he does. This was published on the first page of the journal, this huge announcement from the journal editor about duplicate publication, and the community was warned about this. Okay, so in the guided authors, this is what they will tell you, and this is another Elsevier journal, but you can find this in almost any journal. Submission of a manuscript implies that the work described has not been published before, except in the form of an abstract or as a part of a published lecture or an academic thesis, which is allowable. That is not under consideration for publication elsewhere, that its publication has been approved by all of the authors and tacitly or explicitly by the responsible authorities in the laboratories where the work was carried out, and that if accepted, it will not be published elsewhere in the same form, in either the same or another language, without the consent of the editors and the publisher. Reference should be made to previously published abstracts, etc., in the introductory section. Responsibility for the accuracy of the material in the manuscript, including bibliographic citations, lies entirely with the authors. So this is very clear. I don't see how anybody could possibly misconstrue this. And yet, last year, I received a manuscript for review and I distributed it to one of my editors for handling the reviews. And a reviewer wrote back about 3 days later saying, I received this exact same manuscript from a different journal 2 days ago. And then we found out that there were actually 5 journals that were sent the exact same manuscript, but from these authors. And now I had to go through the process comparing the copies of the manuscripts that they had received against the one that we received. I had to then inform the authors that we were rejecting their manuscript and had to give them a little lecture about scientific misconduct. Also had to write to their department chair and their dean to inform them that they have a person who doesn't seem to know about responsible conduct in research. And I had to write to the editors-in-chief of the other 4 journals, apprise them of what we've discovered, and then they summarily rejected all of those manuscripts as well. So this took a considerable amount of time of my day one day. So it happens, okay? But as an editor-in-chief, it's my responsibility to make sure that it's not allowed to go forward. So this is very current. ChatGPT, AI. This has become the bane of the publishing world, and also in colleges and universities around the world, where students are tasked to write papers, and now they're just using ChatGPT to generate term papers, research papers, and the like. And we get papers all the time in my journal that obviously don't sound like the natural language that people would use in writing a manuscript, especially when it comes from a non-English speaking country. And so now, just like the Authenticate and the other plagiarism tools, there have been platforms that have been assembled to detect the use of AI in generating manuscripts. So it's an increasing problem. It's going to impact academe probably for the rest of time. So here's this article. This new technology presents an evolving set of ethical issues that remain to be resolved. And there's this very nice article, Limitations and Ethical Considerations of Using ChatGPT. There are certain things that are allowable, and there are other things that are not and are considered unethical. This just happens to be just one example extracted of a student who had turned in a paper that he used completely a ChatGPT to generate. If you do a Google search on ChatGPT ethical issues, there's an avalanche of information in the last 3 years. So this is a very significant development in academia, in scientific publishing, and in ethical conduct. So I'm going to close the didactic part of this lecture with a couple of thoughts. So the value of one's contribution to science is judged more on the impact than on the number of one's publications. And it's better to succeed because of one's reputation than in spite of it. All right, so you've been given some very clear information about the appropriate ethical dimensions of publishing and the appropriate construction of manuscripts and authorship and contributorship. So I'm now going to launch into case discussions. Again, these are all original to me. I made these, and I've been using these for the last few years in this workshop, and I'm going to be asking, this is where the audience is going to be participating, okay? So let me read the case. So Mary is a technician in the lab of Dr. Cool. She tends to work during the regular Monday through Friday work week, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and assists graduate students and postdocs in Dr. Kuhl's lab with their projects, as well as doing experimental work specifically assigned to her by Dr. Kuhl. Mostly her work consists of running polyacrylamide gels, Western blots, and polymerase chain reaction. Over a conversation at lunch one day, Mary learned that the lab had recently published a blockbuster paper in Nature Genetics, which included work that she had done in the lab. However, her name was not listed as a co-author of the paper. Mary then confronted Dr. Kuhl about not being included as a co-author on the paper, saying that her work represented a significant contribution. Dr. Kuhl agreed that Mary had contributed substantively to the project and explained that he specifically gave her credit in the acknowledgement section of the paper for technical assistance. To do otherwise, he said, would violate ICMJ guidelines, and that would be uncool. All right, so here are the questions. Does Mary have a legitimate case? Should she have been included as a co-author on the paper? Why or why not? Somebody. Speak up. Okay. Adam, since I can see you sitting there.
Sure. I would say no, that essentially she's performing technical work where she's asked to perform a specific task and then she's paid for it. It's 9 to 5. She hasn't been part of any of the research design. She hasn't been it seems to done any of the 3 things that are required for authorship. She wasn't involved in any of the writing or any of the drafts, and she has been included under the acknowledgement. So I would say, given the criteria that you've given us, it would seem that she doesn't have a legitimate case.
And I would say that you're absolutely correct. It was a very well articulated answer. So clearly you understand what I've been talking about in the last hour. So then it asks, if not, under what circumstances would it have been appropriate to include Mary as a co-author on a paper? Maybe somebody else, maybe Jacob Geiger?
Possible reasons she could be included as an author is if she was analyzing her data and presenting it along with just collecting the data.
What else?
And then also working on the manuscripts for Dr. Kuhl.
Okay. So good. So in other words, that she would have done the 3 things that I explicitly pointed out as the qualifications for what a person must have as contributions to be included as a co-author. Good. So what if Mary had been a graduate student? So she's a technician, okay? But what if she'd been a graduate student or a postdoc in the lab? Would that change your answer? Why or why not?
Megan Sheehan says not as a co-author because she was not involved in the analysis of data or drafting the article. And Jerome says, I agree, she has not done any analysis or interpretation. Some people don't have microphones that work.
Ah, okay, thank you. Okay, good. So regardless, if you didn't do the 3 things that you are required to do to qualify as a co-author, doesn't matter what your station is in the lab, you don't qualify as a co-author. This is a general question. Do you know of instances where technicians have been given co-author status on papers? If so, explain the circumstances. Does anybody know about this? Or
Yeah, Hayden Hess here. We oftentimes include our technicians, particularly if they're running bioassays and then doing the data analysis on that side, calculating coefficients of variation, things like that, leading data collection. And then, of course, we give them opportunity to contribute to the manuscript and then approve the final version. Okay. So oftentimes we do include our technicians.
But you also ensure that they qualify.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So for the particulars of this particular case of Mary, the information we're given is she comes in, she does her job, she gets paid for it, she goes home. She didn't design the experiment, she didn't do anything else. She just, did her job. Okay. And so she doesn't really qualify as a co-author is what the point is. But I know many technicians. I had an amazing technician for 12 years at a prior institution who functioned as at least as the level of a postdoc, and he had a bachelor's degree. The guy was a jack of all trades. He contributed intellectually in the lab group meetings. He helped write drafts of manuscripts. He prepared figures. I mean, he really qualified, and he knew the project. He could give a talk on our project, and he was a technician. He fully qualified for co-authorship, and then I included him on all of my papers. Okay, let's go to the next case.
Quickly, we have a statement from Gitanjali that says your question about an undergrad, they could be named if they worked on the initial draft. Is that correct?
They would have had to done all three things to qualify as an author, not just doing a draft.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, participate actively, intellectually, writing, reviewing. Yes. Okay. Case 2, Dr. Jung is a junior faculty member in the Department of Big Data Science, which is chaired by Dr. IMA Slimebucket. She has just finished writing up a manuscript describing the work her lab has been doing for at least 3 years and is thinking of submitting it to Science. She sends a draft of her manuscript to her department chair for his comments and suggestions. A week later, Dr. Jung receives her manuscript back from Dr. Slimebucket with some minor edits and a few sidebar queries in the margins. She also notices that Dr. Slimebucket has inserted his name on the author line. Dr. Jung thanks Dr. Slimebucket for making suggested edits, but questions including him as a co-author. Dr. Slimebucket insists that his edits were substantive and that including him as a co-author would add, quote, gravitas, close quote, to the paper, given his eminent standing in the field. He also reminds Dr. Jung that her promotion and tenure rely on his goodwill and endorsement of her. Is anybody getting uncomfortable a little bit about this latter part? Okay, you should be. Should Dr. Slimebucket be included as a co-author on Dr. Jung's paper? Why or why not? Let's hear from somebody that hasn't piped in, maybe? Or
I
somebody.
think because can I answer? I think because she just editing the manuscript. We don't consider this person her as a co-author, but we can mention her name in acknowledgement, I think.
You're responding to Dr. Slimebucket. Dr.
Yes.
Jung is the her. We don't know the gender of Dr. Slimebucket. We'll actually say
Sorry, yeah.
him.
Yeah.
Him.
Yes. So,
Yes.
okay. So sorry about that. So I think because this person just did editing for the manuscript, I don't think that we can consider this person as a co-author, but maybe we can put her or his name under the acknowledgement. Sorry. Yes. This is my answer.
And your answer is correct.
This is
reason,
Rich.
reasoned. Go ahead,
I have a
Rich.
question. Because she's technically the senior author and she gets to decide who the list of co-authors are, isn't it? It falls on her to make that call. Is that correct?
When you say who is the senior author?
Dr. Yeah.
Dr. Jung could be the first author. We don't know at this point, but it is her study. She designed it. It was executed in her lab. But the information we're giving is Dr. IMA Slimebucket contributed almost nothing to this. Right?
Correct.
What's it, Rich? What is this an example of? What you would call this? I had a, go ahead.
What did they?
We call it gift authorship or honorary authorship, right? Yeah. Good. If his name was included as a co-author, what aspect of ICMJE guidelines would this illustrate? And basically, I just gave you the answer to that one, gift authorship. If he is not included as a co-author, is there some other way his so-called contributions might be more suitably acknowledged and explained? And I think that Ramesh, maybe, was that you who made the original?
That's correct, it was Ramesh.
So basically in the original answer, it was suggested that maybe more appropriately could acknowledge, just put an acknowledgement thanking Dr. Steinbucket for his useful discussions or editing or whatever. Okay, so it doesn't hurt. It's no huge credit here. Certainly not of the level of an authorship. So it doesn't hurt, and it could help. Okay. If Dr. Steinbucket insists on being included as a co-author, what recourse does Dr. Jung have? You should be getting more uncomfortable here at this point. Somebody needs to say what's on their mind here.
Hi, afternoon.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I'm not sure, but could she do one of two things, approach another faculty member in the department and or go to the ethics board with her concerns?
Yes, I think that would be a initial step. Maybe discuss this with a senior tenured member of the faculty. And I'll discuss why I put those qualifiers on it in a moment. And let's just say that she gets some sage advice. And she goes back to Dr. Steinbucket, but Dr. Steinbucket has said to her, he reminds her that her promotion and tenure rely on his goodwill and endorsement of her.
And Cedric said in the chat that this is probably an HR violation, so you could go to HR if you need.
So it has been suggested it's possibly an HR violation. And what would you call that? What would HR call it?
Quid pro quo, as I mentioned in the chat, I believe.
Oh, okay. Cedric, I'm sorry. I didn't see
Oh,
it.
that's not a problem at all.
That is a very good answer. And it also would be called coercion. Okay. Because basically what he's saying is, if you don't put me as a co-author, you're not going to get promoted because I'm not going to write a letter to support your promotion. That's coercion, and that is HR actionable. Okay. And the State University of New York system has very clear guidelines about that. And it has to do with retribution and retaliation. Okay. So there's a legal remedy here. It's unfortunate. I would take out the pea shooter first and not the cannon. Okay. But take it in steps and try and see if you can get a more reasonable outcome. But this is going to be an uncomfortable situation for Dr. Jung. Okay. And I can tell you right now that I know of cases where this has occurred. Okay. I know of a division chief, not here, at a different medical school. He was a program director of the residency program, and he insisted that his name go on every abstract presented at every conference that his residents presented at. and also any paper that came out of his division. Completely unethical. Okay, so I guess we've covered the last part of this about the unethical behavior, this coercion, and this unfortunately happens more often than you might think. So I'd like to, are there further comments or questions about this case?
I have a question. Do you think this would ever stop? Like you talked about using the pea shooter. I mean, does it seem like fundamentally her two choices long term are just going to be to buckle to all of these demands, or to bring out the cannon? Is there really much in between them?
Well, we don't know if this was a one-off or if this is the way Dr. Slimebucket treats all of his underling, right? And what if more cases come forward? You know, other people, because a lot of times people are not going to talk about this because they're afraid, right? Again, it's coercion, right? But what if they found out, you know, and here's the other aspect to it. We've been told the gender of Dr. Jung, and this is more likely to occur to women by men than men against men. Okay,
Right.
so this becomes a DEI issue that is actionable. Okay, so it has been going on for a long time, and I know personally of such cases, and they usually don't turn out well. So some people will not go against their department chair or their superiors for fear of retribution, and other people will. And if you know of a case like this, you really need to, like they say in the subway, see something, say something, right? Because these people will simply persist and do this their entire career if you don't stop them, all right? Okay, so let's go on to the third case and the last case. So here is another fictional character. Dr. Vishnu Virhir is a member of an NIH study section panel and has been assigned several grant applications for review. One of the applications concerns studies that are directly relevant to the work Dr. Virhir is doing in his own lab, using a brand new and unpublished technique developed by the PI whose application Dr. Virhir is reviewing. Dr. Virhir recognizes the value of this new method and that it would greatly enhance and speed up the work in his own lab. So he provides the details of the new method to a technician in his lab and instructs her to carry out some new experiments using it. The experiments provide spectacular results. Dr. Virhir then writes up and submits a manuscript describing the results and submits it to Cell, one of the leading scientific journals. He also writes and submits a new grant application based largely upon that work, specifically directing it to a different study section than the one on which he had recently served. You've been given a lot of information here. Question: did Dr. Virhir commit scientific misconduct? Why or why not? And then if so, under what part of the ORI definition of scientific misconduct does this fall? Who wants to chime in here?
That it's very similar to the Bridges case. Another person says, yes, plagiarism is.
Yes, plagiarism. And remember that the ORI definition covers the review of work, not just submitting publications, but this guy's been guilty of two different areas of plagiarism, right? Because submitting a manuscript and then submitting a grant application. If Dr. Virhir's submitted manuscript was rejected, so not published, or grant application was unsuccessful, so not funded, would this change your answer? Why or why not? Rich, are you still with us?
No, it wouldn't change my opinion because it was still the theft and misappropriation of someone else's intellectual property.
Does everybody understand that? That's the correct answer, by the way. Hopefully everybody understands that. The very fact, remember that I talked about this, the very fact that it never sees the light of public scrutiny doesn't mean that it wasn't misconduct. As soon as you engaged in the plagiarism, you stole somebody else's original work, you have committed scientific misconduct. Whether it's ever published, ever funded in a grant application, the very fact that you wrote a manuscript and submitted it, and even recorded it in your laboratory notebooks, even if you didn't submit it for publication, and submitted a manuscript and or a grant application, you've engaged in scientific misconduct. Oh, this is kind of interesting. Is Dr. Verheer's lab tech guilty of scientific misconduct? Why or why not?
So I'd say that the lab tech is still guilty of misconduct, because I remember from last week that even if you are unknowing of conduct like plagiarism, etc., you are still guilty of it because you partake in it.
Are there, thank you for that answer. Are there other opinions?
Yeah, I disagree. I think it depends what Dr. Verheer says. Did he say, "Oh, here, I stole this methodology. Can you use it on our in our lab?" Probably he wrote up a protocol and said, "I've been thinking about trying this new protocol." So the lab tech probably doesn't know that it was a purloined idea.
Thank you, Michelle. So that is also true. So strictly speaking, because of the lab tech knowingly or unknowingly, probably unknowingly, engaged in utilizing a privileged communication, but upon review, like let's say this case goes to a misconduct evaluation panel review, the lab tech would basically not be charged with misconduct, because remember at the end when I talked about the degree, was this a one-off? Was it intentional, knowing, reckless? These various qualifiers. In this particular case, this person didn't even know. They thought Dr. Verheer came up with this, and I think reasonably. Okay, so I don't think that this person would actually be found guilty, although they would not evade likely inquiry. Okay, if this came to an inquiry panel. In fact, this is exactly what happened to the technician down the hall from me in Dr. Bridges' lab. He was given literally the method section typed up as a manuscript of the paper that he received for review from the PNAS. He was instructed to do the experiments that were outlined. The technician had no idea that Dr. Bridges did not come up with that himself. And he conducted the work. He got the results. They happened to be exactly like what the original group described. And boy, was he surprised when the NIH showed up at his laboratory saying, are you so-and-so? What was your part in this, etc.? And he had to be part of the inquiry, but he was found not guilty because he had absolutely no knowledge that he was doing anything wrong. Okay, so it is problematic. Okay, and finally, why do you think Dr. Verheer directed his grant application to an alternative study section, not the original one where this grant had been reviewed previously? Why do you think he did that?
I mean, it's so, it's to minimize or to reduce the chances that it will be spotted. That, with another study, he can't plausibly invoke the defense. He's a member of an NIH study section panel. He's, he knows, should be fully aware of what the relevant ethical behavior is, and is deliberately trying to sidestep it.
Yeah, are there other chat comments or no, Kathleen?
Basically, the head what he was doing to conceal, submerge his plagiarism and not be spotted, because most likely this group is not going to be reviewers on the this different study section.
Right. So, the study section review, there's, 20 some odd people sitting around the table, and there's probably 2 or 3 other reviewers that were assigned the exact same grant to review. So he doesn't want to go to that same study section when people are going to have a sense of deja vu. Hey, I've seen this someplace else recently. And so he wants to have a complete naive set of eyes looking at this so that they wouldn't possibly know that he had stolen this from somebody else. And you're absolutely right. The Costanza defense could not possibly be used with a straight face. All right, good. So I think that's all I've got. If there are any questions, I'm going to stop sharing. Any questions or comments?
Yes, afternoon again. I do have a question. So in the last case, the technician would not have been found guilty of plagiarism. But last week when we had this, I think similar to what Dr. Redman was trying to point out, if someone working under, say, Dr. Verheer's grant had submitted a manuscript to him, he had, revised it, reviewed it, and then submitted it, and that manuscript was found to have evidence of plagiarism unknown to the head of the lab, would he still have been responsible? Even if leniency were applied to his case, would he still have been considered responsible for that?
If you're talking about what the person who's responsible is the head of the laboratory who should have known what was going on, is that what you're asking?
Right.
Yes. So that again, the buck stops at the top, right? So that you're the head of the laboratory. The conduct of people that work under you is you're responsible as well. Now, what typically happens in reality is it's the degree of the egregiousness of what occurred. And as somebody who had no knowledge, maybe they should have not knowledge, but maybe that clever person who had engaged in the misconduct was clever enough to purposely make it very, very difficult for that person to be able to exercise their responsibility and oversight. So as the inquiry panel would dig into it, I think that would be taken into account for any liability that the person would be charged with. Yeah. A lot of the stuff that, seems black and white, there's actually a lot of gray. And that's why you have to have all of the particulars in a adjudication phase where you look at all of the evidence and you find out, okay, how do we find here culpability, and what is the appropriate action to take for each person who may have been involved in this, okay? Typically, the people who had absolutely no knowledge, they were just, following order. Where have you heard that defense before? Like I said, it's nobody died here, okay? Nobody was executed. But the degree of egregiousness is going to factor into what the final findings are in the case and how it is adjudicated. Okay.